Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webcast entitled PRIMEChat, Better Insights, Better PR-ROI. Today's conversation is brought to you by Prime Research and powered by Onstream Media. With PRIMEChat, top corporate communicators from some of the world's most prominent organizations share compelling experiences, guidelines, and insights promoting research in public relations. Prime Research, along with partners, the Institute for Public Relations, supports this series of one-on-one interviews featuring the profession's top PR research thought leaders. Presenters to date include speakers from McDonald's, SAP, and KPMG. This latest installment features Dr. David Michaelson, Global Director of Research and Insights for Teneo. Dr. Michaelson will be interviewed by fellow IPR Commission member, PRIME CEO Mark Weiner, a member of the Arthur Page Society and author of books, essays, and features about PR research. To submit a question or comment at any time during the webcast, please click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. Simply type your question in the box and click the Submit button. Alternatively, you could submit your question via Twitter using the hashtag PRIMEChat. All questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to today's moderator, Mark Weiner. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks, everyone, for joining us. Let me introduce David, longtime friend, and it's really a wonderful thing when a friend can lead and teach, as I've learned so much from David over the years. He and I are both members of the Institute for Public Relations Measurement Commission, but we've had opportunities to work together, and I'm grateful for those. By introduction, David is recipient of many, many awards, the Jackson and Wagner Behavioral Science Prize. He's a member of the PR News Measurement Hall of Fame. He's earned 2 silver anvils, and he's the author of some of the most important books on the subject of public relations and research. His textbook, The Professional and Practitioner's Guide to Public Relations Research, Measurement, and Evaluation, is now in its 3rd edition, and just published was this week a communication guide for investor relations in an age of activism. It's my pleasure to welcome David and to share the floor with him. David, it's your turn.
Well, thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be on with you. Mark and I have known each other for many, many years, both on a personal and in a business relationship, and thank you for the warm introduction. I also, by the way, just to acknowledge that in terms of the textbooks, I'm not the only author of these books. One of my very dear friends, Don Stacks from the University of Miami, was the primary co-author on the first book that Mark mentioned, and other texts and other books were written with Marcia DiStasso, also from the University of Florida. Let me go through what we're going to be talking about today, which is really talking about a concept of measurement and metrics for public relations, but it's another way of thinking about it from the way that many ways it has been traditionally discussed. One of the challenges with public relations research is it oftentimes gets very, very narrowly segmented, and it doesn't think about the entire communication process. So what we're going to be talking about today is a method which is oftentimes referred to, and you'll see it within the textbook that Don Stacks and I wrote, is the concept called end-to-end measurement. And what it looks at here is the entire concept that measurement has to start from the origination of the message through the impact of the message in order for us to actually determine how effective communication is. Now, I also want to put this within a very simple context. And before we get into going through the presentation, I want to talk about the difference between measurement and evaluation, and really talking about the purpose of what we do as a profession. Oftentimes, we look at some of the challenges of communication research is that people feel that they're being judged. Are they succeeding or are they failing? That is a process which I tend to deem similar to getting a report card. Once you get the grade, you can't do anything about it. The method that we're going to be talking about today is more of a measurement approach, which looks at the progress of communications and how you use communications to achieve goals in order to assure that you're going to be successful in meeting business objectives. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this discussion. And this has been an evolution of a lot of my work over the years. And in terms of my experience, in terms of when I started in the public relations profession in the early 80s at Burson Marsteller. One of the things about it is that understanding, and this is really focusing on the concept of the science beneath the art, is communications is really needs to have use of data. And it's by the use of data that we can actually make better informed decisions. Because what we're really talking about is how do we actually develop the best ideas, how do we communicate those best messages, how do we talk about the impact of those messages, and how do we take corrective actions. Let's see, if you forgive me for a moment, this slide was moving a little slowly. Okay, so what we really want to understand here is, and this is on the next slide, which is really thinking about the process by which communication works within public relations. It really is, and this is a very simple process of communication theory. Communication theory is oftentimes much more complicated than this. There's much more impact issues. But it really says here, as communications professionals, we are starting with a message. We are developing that message. We hopefully are doing the research to back up that message to determine whether it's impactful. And then we are delivering that message through an intermediary. Now, that has changed somewhat over the past few years as we see the rise of social media, the rise of owned outlets, and around other types of communication. But if we're looking at the more traditional media format, we do not necessarily always control our message. And so it's the role of the intermediary which does impact how we are delivering our message to our target audience. We're not always assured that we're going to be able to deliver that message. We're not always assured it's going to be translated. We don't know if there's going to be editorialization around that message. So this is part of the process that we have to keep in mind, is that we are not speaking always directly to our target audience, but rather oftentimes have to manage that intermediary through the process. Now, the challenge here is also thinking through that target audience. And we have to understand how that messages are actually processed. The processing of messages is actually a three-stage process. And now this is a model that you're seeing on this slide, which Don Stacks and I have written about, which is called the BASIC model. And what the BASIC model essentially says is that in order to communicate, you have to go through, and to have a business impact, you have to go through a series of linear stages that actually need to be sequential in order to achieve the impact that we want. First one is, are we aware? Have I heard of the brand, the company, the organization, the issue? Preferably top-of-mind awareness. Do I have knowledge about it, the correct level of knowledge? Do I know the accuracy of what it is? So if I'm talking about automobiles, do I know it's an automatic transmission or a manual transmission? Do I know it has 4 tires? I mean, again, basic factual information. The third level here, which is the issue of relevancy of the message. Is the message actually impactful? Does it have meaning? Is it influential? Is it persuasive? Does it create interest and preference in the idea that I want? And only do I go through those 3 stages will the next 2 and very effective things happen. Will I get somebody to consider an action? An example of automotive, will I get them to test drive a car? Will I get them to make a serious purchase consideration? And just as importantly, and more importantly in the world of social media, will I actually then create a willingness of those people who have become my customers, who have become those people whom I want to influence, to advocate on my behalf, and essentially to extend the message, and again, oftentimes through social media, but oftentimes through direct contact. The first 3 stages that we talked about, awareness, knowledge, and interest and preference, are the necessary but not sufficient conditions which communicators can control. And the objective of what we need to do as we go through this process is making sure that we understand what stage we're at in communications, and to measure against those stages to assure that we are actually achieving business objectives. So when we look at the matrix here, where we look at the 5 levels across the top: awareness, knowledge and understanding, interest and consideration, preference and support, action and advocacy, and then look at the 3 phases that we're talking about: public relations activity, intermediary effect, target audience effect. How do we then look at that as how it achieves business results? So if we look at the first stage here, which is public relations activity, and look at the issue of building awareness and going across all the way to action and advocacy, what are the public relations activities that we're involved in? Media engagement, bloggers, events and speaking, social media posting. So all of those factors are here where we are, in fact, actually pushing out the message. Again, hopefully a message which we understand and have tested to understand to be impactful. So that becomes the first stage, which we are measuring here. Are we actually delivering are we actually delivering the intended message? There'll be a number of times, and we've had discussions with many of my clients, are we actually considering, have we looked at, have we understood whether or not we're actually evaluating editorially what we're sending out to make sure that we're actually doing a good job delivering messages? One particular client I was working with, it wasn't a function of them delivering the correct messages. In that case, it was a function of delivering too many messages, which was actually limiting their ability to gain media attention. So this is a multi-phase process of thinking. The next stage, the intermediary effect, is now looking at a variety of measures that we need to take a look at. How many articles have been published? Again, because you have to have a certain degree of volume in order to reach. Is there a frequency? Are we getting impressions? Again, very simplistic measures. Is there share of voice? But the next thing, which is most important here, is are we aligning key messages and accuracy of our facts going forward? Because while there are a number of factors that influence communication, the fact of the matter is that if you don't get that message delivered, you'll have no impact. I have argued, and maybe not successfully, that one of the least important measures that we look at in communication is sentiment. Why am I saying that? Because everybody seems to be concerned in terms of content analysis when looking at sentiment. And so I'm speaking here, it may sound a little bit sacrilegious, but what we've discovered is that if you don't deliver, that sentiment follows the delivery of the message. So don't worry about sentiment, but rather, are you actually delivering the message that's most important? I should point out that there is a new paper that is being published in Public Relations Journal. It should be out. I thought it was going to be last week. I think it's going to be published within the next week, where Don Stacks and Jennifer Clark from Teneo, one of my researchers at Teneo, have done an analysis where it actually showed that sentiment and message presence are actually incredibly closely correlated and interact with each other. So you should be looking for that paper, which give a greater explanation of what that is. Then when we look at interest and consideration, again, we're looking at the message alignment, because these are the points of the messaging which are most persuasive in terms of the entire process. And then finally, we're looking at, are we getting, that's where the sentiment comes in, are we getting endorsement? Are we getting retweets? Are we getting people who are commenting and spreading that message and creating a positive environment? The next area, which is the target audience effect, now we're actually measuring impact on the audience, looking at those first 3 elements of awareness, knowledge, and relevance, and impact of the message. Are we, in fact, actually generating the environment through the presence of the message so that we can ask the question, have you heard of these? Have you heard of this brand? Do you know what this brand or product does? Is the message meaningful and relevant to you in order to create an effect? In essence, would you buy something if you never heard of it, you didn't know what it did, and it didn't have any benefit to you? I've had some people tell me that they have, but let's take that as an anomaly. And so that becomes the basic, that becomes the core of the measures. Again, for more detail on that, these are also based upon, this was based upon a model of standardized measures that were published. I guess Don Stacks and I worked on this in, I'm going to guess about 2011, in a paper that we published, which was very influential in terms of the idea of thinking about the concept of standardized measures going forward so you can draw comparative evaluations. So let's now talk about a typical measurement process. The typical measurement process, and this is again thinking about those people who are beginning to enter the idea of actually doing measurement over a period of time. Have you started with a desk review? Have you started with existing research that is already there? It becomes a very simple cost of entry. It's the thing that anybody can do. Sometimes it's as simple as internet research. Sometimes it's a matter of asking clients for existing research. But it becomes the basic thing that has to be done first. What is out there that already exists that you don't have to replicate? Secondly, have you tested your messages? Do you know that these messages are impactful? Do you know that they're meaningful? Are they speaking the truth about your product in a way that's compelling? As somebody in advertising who I worked with for many years used to say, is it the truth well told, which is creating an impact and the effect of what we want to create? The next mark, have we created a benchmark to determine those 5 levels that we've talked about? Awareness, knowledge, relevance, persuasion, purchase intent, or intent to take action, and also finally willingness to advocate. Are we doing content analysis to determine if the message is actually being delivered, not for sentiment, but rather, not for topic, but rather are we in fact actually delivering the intended message through the media? And then finally, are we following this up with periodic measurement to determine the impact against our target audience? And that is the concept of the end-to-end measurement system, which says you have to look at the entire process, which actually tracks the process of the message from its point of origination to its point of impact. So let's talk about, in conclusion, our objective, the core objective here is to measure the contribution to achieving business goals. That's where we have to put this focus. This isn't about getting hits in the newspaper. This isn't about getting blog posts. This isn't about there. It's about delivering messages which reach a target audience, which has an impact on their behavior, which is the most important thing that we talk about as a support to the overall business objectives of our clients and our companies. And my recommendation in conclusion is to start simply. Make sure you know what the messages are. Make sure that those messages are aligned. And what will happen is if your messages are well developed, if your messages are delivered, and you measure in terms of the progress for the delivery of those messages, the results will follow, both in terms of the sentiment of your media as well as the business results. And with that being said, Mark, I hope we've delivered what we intended to today.
You have. Thank you very much. So on the screen now, if anybody's interested in learning more about the books that David has co-authored, there are 2 here, and you'll see also a link to the instituteforpr.org. And that's a great source of information. There's papers by David, there's papers from me there, as well as probably 100 papers that represent, I think, some of the best thinking on the topic. And most of them are very, very accessible, written for the practitioner. So I encourage you to visit that. It's free for all the downloads, and there's an awful lot to learn there. So before we get to audience questions, and I encourage those who are participating to send the questions in that question tab on the screen. Let me start with some questions of my own, and do my best to represent the interests of the audience. So in addition to starting simply, as you say in your last slide, what advice would you give for those just getting started, and especially for those with limited resources?
Well, the first one is, and it's not really advice per se. Is don't be afraid of measurement. Measurement is not your enemy. Measurement is your friend. It is not a case of whether you're going to succeed or fail. It's a way to start thinking about success. But the simple way to start with this one is understanding what is out there existing in terms of what is actually happening in the world concerning your product in terms of your issues. There's an enormous amount of information there which provides fundamental guidance, which talks about the competitive environment that you may be looking in. So it's, again, don't be afraid to start with the existing research. Don't assume that you have to create things from scratch. Mm-hmm. The second thing, which is also critical, is to also make sure, and this is going to sound very simple, and it's going to sound oftentimes very obvious, but you'd be surprised how oftentimes failure occurs. Are you actively monitoring the delivery of your messages to make sure that you're actually sending them out, to make sure that they're going out there? That's the first stage in terms of what it is. While most people do not consider that a form of measurement, it becomes one of the most critical stages that anybody can do, which is if you don't deliver the message, the media won't pick it up, and therefore you'll never be able to measure impact. So it becomes very critical here to think through editorial systems and editorial review systems, which will assure that your messages are actually included where they're supposed to be. So that's what I would say are the two starting points that you have to take a look at as part of any measurement system.
Okay, so, and those are free, and absolutely within the reach of anybody within public relations. So the second one about just making sure that your press releases contain the messages that you are trying to deliver is, you're right, it sounds obvious, but it's not so obvious. And I can't tell you how many vanity press releases I've seen in my life where an executive in a company is speaking at the Rotary, and that doesn't really, those kinds of press releases don't really convey the kind of information that you're talking about. And adhering to that principle of making sure that whatever you're sending is actually supporting your objective is a great way to guard against that kind of vanity within the organization, so that people don't ask for those kinds of vanity releases to begin with. And of course, using Google and online sources has enabled more people to do more research inexpensively and quickly than I think anything. I would add two other things, if I may, David. One is that if we're doing surveys and some of the surveys and content analysis, where maybe the project is bigger than what one person could do, I found local universities to be a great source. If there's a public relations course that's being taught, or there's a PR-SSA chapter, professors and students are looking for this kind of experience, and it may be an alternative. So in exchange for the experience, the public relations professional gets more research than they would otherwise get. And the other thing I would suggest is setting objectives that are measurable from the beginning, so that when it comes time to communicate these results, everybody knows whether you've succeeded or not. You talked about the notion of research as a report card, and I like your idea that rather than a report card, research is more like a tutor. It teaches you, with every go-round what you can do differently and better. But by setting objectives and then measuring against those objectives, as you said, is free. Setting objectives is free, and if they're reasonable, anybody can do them. So tell me, what in your experience, you've worked with giant companies, Coca-Cola, AT&T, and others. What's the biggest misunderstanding you've encountered about research in public relations?
Well, I think there's a couple of them. One, that it is impossible to do or difficult to do, or nobody knows how to really do it. So I think that's one. The other one is that it's about measuring success or failure. Those two things create incredible barriers, which give people an excuse not to do it. It's a matter of what we're dealing with here is a mindset more so than anything else. The real challenge that I've always said is if we think about success or failure, do you want to go to the person you report to who manages and controls your budget and said, oops, I didn't achieve my goals? Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to do that. So we have to change that perspective, and the perspective that we have to shift to is is not to think about the end point, but think about the stages along the way that we need to achieve, and how are we achieving, broken down each stage along the way, and knowing that there are diagnostic aspects that we can do from the research which provide us a prescriptive basis going forward. And I think that's the reason. It's that mindset issue and not understanding how research does provide benefits that really is the biggest challenge.
Yeah, so I'm sure you've had these experiences too. At the end of the year, somebody wants an evaluation of their performance when it's too late to do anything about it, and sometimes those reports don't deliver what the person hopes it will deliver, and then there's nothing you can do about it. So rather than waiting to the end of the year, like you're saying, there are phases throughout the year that give the communicator opportunities to assess and adjust and refine throughout the year, so that there's always feedback and opportunities to improve. So do you think, I'm thinking about why more people don't do research in public relations. And you mentioned fear. I think that's how I would characterize what you're saying. So you've mentioned resources like budget and the misunderstanding that it has to be expensive or complicated, and also this fear of evaluation. What are those the reasons, or are there other reasons you can think of?
Well, I think there are. There's one other reason which comes to mind is this is an industry that has. I've met a lot of smart people in this industry over the years. One of the things that you hear them talk about is their instincts. Oh, yeah, my instincts are. Okay. Now, there are some great communicators out there that have great instincts. However, that doesn't change the fact that while your instincts about messaging may be right, your instincts about what the issue may be right, the mechanical process by which communications is delivered is not an instinctually based issue. And so they're saying is, oh, I know what I'm doing. I'm a professional. Look at the successes I've had. I can do this. And they're missing the point of really what we're trying to do. There are times when I tell people, ignore the research, ignore what it's saying, because sometimes the instincts are counterintuitive and sometimes they're right. And sometimes we have to be, as researchers, we have to be sensitive to that. But it doesn't change the fact that as we measure progress, as we look at issues as they go forward, there are certain aspects which are not instinctually based. Mm-hmm. The matter is, are things actually being delivered? Because if you don't deliver the message, nobody hears it. If nobody hears it, nobody's going to take an action.
Yeah. So I think there's reacting to what you're saying, I think there's, and going back to an earlier question about misunderstandings, I think there's a misunderstanding that prevents more people from doing more research, and that is that research kills creativity. And I think that's sort of what you were just saying, that if you have, and what I would argue is that if you have the right, if you have the research that tells you the right target audience, the right channels to reach that audience, the right messaging, or the right themes, let's say, to persuade that audience, then the creativity, it becomes what I call more focused creativity. Given these assets, how does one now create a campaign around that? How to execute a campaign, some short burst of activity that is more likely to succeed based on the research rather than having it be a purely creative endeavor. I know you've worked at agencies. I've worked at agencies. And I've been through these ideation sessions where it just seems to be so much of, this worked for that client, we can do the same thing here. And it doesn't really constitute research, going around the table for whatever account people happen to be available for lunch that day and want, free lunch. The research gives real grounding, and it provides a foundation for for creativity to really have an effect?
Well, I think I was going to say fundamentally the exact same thing, but I'm going to give a different analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Restrictions on what you can do are not limiting creativity, but in fact raise the bar of what's challenging to do great creativity.
Exactly.
Okay, so I want you to think about a football field. Well, what would this game be like if you didn't have boundaries? It raises the level of the skill of the athlete to achieve something within the boundaries of the game and the rules and the boundaries of the field. If you run amok in the field, you don't have a game. And the creativity and the skills that are required are diminished, not enhanced.
Excellent analogy. I think I'm going to use that. I had an experience with an agency president. Now, it was earlier in my career, and I assumed that everybody did research. It's in every textbook that you're supposed to do research in communication. And I just assumed everybody was. They just didn't tell me about it. And I was having a conversation with an agency president of a mid-sized agency. I won't name them, but they had clients whose names you would absolutely recognize, some of the world's biggest brands, and brands that are known for measurement, for measuring everything in their marketing mix. And he revealed something to me that I've never forgotten. He said, I would rather forego being a proven success in exchange for never being a proven failure. And that struck me in a big way because it revealed that people don't measure, and not only do they not measure, they actively avoid it. And it's not just because of budget or an inability to work with numbers. There was something else in what he was saying at that time.
Well, that's the mindset that I was talking about. If you use a mindset which says, and I draw a distinction between evaluation and measurement, and maybe I'm parsing the language overly, but evaluation says, did I succeed or fail?
Mm-hmm.
Measurement says, how far have I gotten to achieve my goal?
Yes. Yes, and I can't think of a CEO that would not prefer measurement as a way to improve rather than having no feedback for refinement at all. So I think there's also a mentality maybe within the organization that research is not a report card, not a means of punishing underachievement, but as a way to learn and grow.
Well, we need to start thinking like the Japanese. And one of the things that one of the key things, and this goes back to the early 1960s, when Japan was considered to be third-tier, poor-quality manufacturing. So there was a guy who was a professor at NYU at the time, and his name was Edward Deming. And Deming, who is what is known as the father of statistical process control. And what the SPC model really said is that you measure statistically every stage along the way because each one of them is a potential failure point. And if you can correct the failure points along the way, you will be successful and have higher quality.
Right. So embracing failure as a way to learn.
Yes. And don't be afraid to fail.
Yes. That's not so easy for anybody. I think human nature, but having that kind of culture certainly fosters the kind of thinking that you're describing. Let me ask you a question, David, from one of the attendees, and I'm going to read it verbatim. David, your end-to-end approach is compelling. Why is it, do you think, that PR has found it so hard historically to make a success of the strategic planning function, to understand its role and benefits PR work, to recruit the right people, and to change effectively for it? So we've been talking about research and evaluation. This question, I think, speaks to the upfront part, the planning. So why do you think that planning has not been a priority?
Well, I think that, and if I can speculate, because I think there are a couple of reasons. One of them is that the planning model has traditionally come out of advertising, where advertising, which was buying media and paying for creative and paying an enormous amount of money for that purpose, was focused on because it was a controlled message. There was much more focus in terms of doing that. Which leads into the other reason why this has probably happened is our industry has evolved enormously. Where if you go back to the earlier days of public relations and going back into, I'm trying to think of the very, very earliest days. And my memory is slipping in terms of the founders of the industry, but that's not so important. Is that we were focused as a media relations activity, and media relations was seen as an art form and not necessarily a science. If we continue to think of ourselves as a communications medium, which is predominantly media relations, I understand the reason why the planning wasn't there, because it was seen as this person has great relationships, they're able to pick up the phone, they're able to get this reporter on the line, or they're able to send them a press release and do a press conference, and it was a tactically focused industry, not a strategically focused industry. But as communications has become more competitive and more thoughtful in that way, we have to shift towards a strategic approach. And that has been the hard transition for many, many people. There are still a number of agencies out there and there are a number of practitioners out there who are still very much media relations focused. I'm not downplaying the importance of media relations. It's critical to what we do. But at the same time, a lot of what we're also doing here is the counseling and directing. We have paid, earned, shared, and owned media today, not just simply earned media. And we have to start thinking in broader ways of different ways of communicate, whether it be investor relations, whether it be employee relations, where there are controlled messages. We have to think through our business objectives. The number of times that I've lectured where I've asked the question, and I'm saying is, who is our target audience? And somebody in the room says, it's the media. And the first thing I said was, you just failed the course. Because you don't understand you don't understand the point.
And it's also a diminishing target, at least traditional media. So those days when there were 10 newspapers in New York City, that's 60, 70 years ago. So it's just not the same.
Yeah.
I can think of an example for another an experience I had with planning in preliminary planning for target audience segmentation. It was for a luxury car brand, like a sports car brand, and the PR team were all, I'd say, I'm going to guess, 50 or 60-year-old men, and their idea of PR was getting journalists out to the track and driving these cars at a high speed. And, it was fun. It's what they had always done. And we did some demographics analysis to identify who their target audience really is. Who owns or who plans to buy a luxury import sports car in the next 6 months. It turned out that it was the media outlet with the highest penetration to the target audience was Martha Stewart Living, which flipped these guys out. Everything to them was Road and Track, Car and Driver, Motor Trend, all the car books, and the car buff magazines. And they were so far off. Those magazines were just maybe ranked 30th or 40th out of 100. So it totally flipped the way that they were looking at things. The people who were buying that car weren't track guys. There were women of a certain means who wanted that. So knowing that, I don't know. I think I don't know how they recovered, but it meant that they had to start being more inclusive in who they were targeting and how they were speaking to that target, because they had totally dismissed the buyer in their traditional approach.
Well, let me suggest a couple of things that also are inexpensive forms of research, which is to address exactly what you're talking about, which is how do we understand what the media interests are of the person who is interested or uses the product. So, for example, there are syndicated surveys which are available, which are not particularly expensive. One of them is SMRB, Simmons Market Research Bureau. The other one is MRI, which used to be called Media Market Research. And what they do is these are surveys which are predominantly used by advertisers. But what they also provide here is exactly what you're talking about, Mark, which is they provide an ability to say is, here's a product category, who is using the product, what is the media that you're using, what are the outlets? And oftentimes there are surprises. Let me give you an example of one like that, which I did, I'm going to guess, about 5 or 6 years ago with a client, where it was a inexpensive white wine. And they were using one of the stars of the Food TV network as the person to talk about this, as a spokesperson, talking about cooking and wine. Well, it turns out to be that when you start looking at the activities of the people who were actually buying the brand, they were more interested in taking the bottle of wine sitting in a hot tub and not cooking. So what they had here was surrounding an entire program and campaign and communication, which was using the wrong focus, exactly as you're talking about. There's an old adage from a great advertising guy named Ed McCabe, who's the guy who did It Takes a Great Man to Make a Tender Chicken for Purdue. And he said, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten.
That's a good one. So here's another question from our audience. What are some of the best measurement tools available today?
Well, the best tool is the one which addresses the needs that you have. I'll give a plug. I'm going to say is I'm a Prime client. They are the best in the business. By the way, Mark, I mean that sincerely. I'm not just a plug. That is one of the best sources out there in terms of the thoughtfulness and the science and using this as a scientific basis. I think believe it or not, one of the best tools out there is your client's research to understand what they've done from the marketing department, and the linkage to marketing is one of the best tools out there that you can use. Pre-testing messaging is one of the best tools that you can use. But the key tool in the whole thing is not really a tool at all. It's keeping in mind the end objective that you're measuring behavioral change.
Got it. So I think I'm interpreting this question a little bit differently, and I appreciate you saying what you said about Prime. But now in the marketplace there are hundreds and hundreds, maybe 500 or more, fully automated content analysis tools. And I think I know that market better than I know survey tools, but I know that there are survey tools, SurveyMonkey, and there are others that didn't exist, 15 years ago. So,
okay, well, let me address that because, and Mark, you've heard me speak about this before. Are we eventually going to have automated analysis tools which are actually going to be effective and accurate? And the answer is maybe in a decade from now. I have a feeling that the NSA and the CIA probably have some pretty good tools right now, but they're not sharing them. But what we have right now here is the automated tools in and of themselves are misleading and highly ineffective. And that if we're going to be using accuracy of tools, which really goes back, by the way, to the reason why I said about Prime, is that it's the still notion is we can't dismiss the notion of humans reading and understanding in terms of what's going on there. So using hybridized systems may be a way to approach this, but we still need to hit the best tool out there is still the human mind. In its ability to look and read, and understand subtlety, and understand the distinctions between it. We can't dismiss that. When it comes to surveys, yes, there are a ton of tools out there that can be used. So there's SurveyMonkey, there's Qualtrics, there's probably half a dozen DIY-type survey mechanisms. While they can be very effective tools for inexpensive distribution of questionnaires to your audience, there's still a major limitation to those products. You still have to be a qualified researcher in order to do a really good job. You still have to understand some of these issues. You still have to be able to write an unbiased question. So, for example, we use SurveyMonkey at Teneo. Why do we use it? Well, there are sometimes internal surveys or small-scale surveys where we have a controlled audience, where we're not worried about randomization, where we're not worried about projectability. And it's a very fast, inexpensive tool, but it doesn't change the fact that you still have to know how to write that questionnaire. It still has to be written properly, and that's one of the reasons why Don Stacks and I wrote that paper on standardization to say is what are the types of questions you should be asking to assure reliable, both valid and reliable results. Validity meaning that are you asking, is the question you're asking getting the information you need? Reliability meaning is it going to be consistently played over a period of time so that as you track surveys and ask different people questions, will you get a result which is measurable and comparable across audiences. So, we still can't lose the skill of the researcher. I'll give you an example. There's a survey that I just read the other day where just in terms of basic research skills, which is, again, one of the key things that we need to keep in consideration, where the person wrote an analysis of what's called a convenience sample. What a convenience sample is that I'm going to get people from a list and I'm going to email out a series of surveys, and I hope that they respond, or I pull things off of a list, or a variety of things like that, as opposed to truly randomized, or a panel which actually uses demographically balanced samples. And they reported an error rate of plus or minus like 4% or 5% or something like that. Well, it's a convenience sample. There is no error rate because it's not projectable. So what we're getting at here is there needs to be, we can't dismiss the fact that simply having the ability to have a cheap, easy-to-use distribution system like a SurveyMonkey is not a substitution for actually knowing how to write the questionnaire.
Yeah.
So I'm using that as a cautionary statement.
Yeah, two comments I have. One is that tools are a part of it. So technology does what technology can do. It's fast, it's consistent, and as far as these measurement tools go, they're accessible. But to your point, that's only one piece of the puzzle. The second piece of the puzzle is statistical acumen and critical thinking, which I think is what you were speaking to, and as well as category expertise. So, understanding the difference between, survey for, surveys are done for different purposes. Surveys for public relations means you have to understand communication, the media, how journalism works, how social media work in a way that just a person who knows how to write a survey couldn't represent.
Well, I think you're getting at a point which we tell our clients, which is as we approach research. The first one is that we call ourselves data source agnostic. I don't care where the data comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, it could be social media, it could be traditional media, it could be surveys, it could be focus groups, it could be an internet secondary research source. We look for data that provides information that we can start analyzing, interpreting, and understanding. But to the point that you just talked about, Mark, there are three things which we consider to be what are critical in terms of achieving success. And in these days, data science, having the ability to truly be able to do that statistical analysis, pull data, get your data sourcing in there, is a critical thing. Mm-hmm. Social science rigor. I think people have stopped paying attention to that. But
yeah, I think there's.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was going to say I think there's a sliding scale now of what constitutes good enough, and I think there are people who, and that's a subjective measure of what's good enough, and I think a lot of people accept what's good enough through some of these tools, which seem inexpensive or free, or but like you're saying, without a human guidance, there's it's not going to be the highest quality. Let me ask you. Oh, go ahead.
Let me finish with the third part of the stool.
Sure,
which is the subject matter expertise, exactly as you mentioned.
Yep.
So we work in teams. Researchers at Teneo don't work independent of the teams. I am here working on a major rebranding project in Colorado, and I am here with a key account person, and we are working on this together because they know the subject, I know the research. Together, it becomes a great team.
There you go. So let me ask you the last question we received. We have 8 minutes to go, and I'll read it verbatim. David, what is your recommendation to clients for how frequently they should reevaluate their target markets, who they are, what they want, how they consume information, and the impact of new industry players and innovations? All of this has an impact on messaging strategies.
Yeah, you have to. That's a constant process.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't do it as a point in time. You're continually looking at that. We're standing in quicksand. That's how quickly things are moving.
So that's interesting. In my experience, I'm gonna challenge what you said. So maybe this is our friendly debate part of it. Is that certain aspects of a plan are strategic, and then there's tactics through which you execute against the strategy and objectives. And for me, the strategy is more stable, and it may last a year or more when, unless something dramatic happens, when there's a new product introduction or something really that changes it. That messaging, like the concepts, the themes, don't change that often, and the audiences don't change that often. When it comes time for the tactical execution, you might have to refresh to pinpoint within your target market to get just the right people, or you may have to pinpoint messaging in a way that aligns with whatever it is you're promoting through this campaign. But they always link back to the strategic messaging that's done less frequently.
Well, I can't argue with that, in fact, I actually agree with you. But let me add in the reason why I said what I said. Mm-hmm. I tend not to deal with consumer marketing. I tend to deal with corporate issues, as for most of what I'm dealing with. And even when I'm dealing with consumer issues, consumer products, it tends to be on the issue side. Yes, you have to have a strategy in terms of what it is, and yes, you always have to focus that strategy in terms of what it is. But oftentimes, we're dealing with moving targets. Mm-hmm. Because we're oftentimes dealing with crises-oriented situations where oftentimes the audience may change and the issues may change, and so we have to be adaptable in that regard. We have to be cognizant of the long-term strategy going forward for the brand or the product or the issue, but we also have to have that responsive side. I woke up this morning to a client who is ceasing production over a crisis. It affects the entire brand and the entire role of CEO.
Wow.
So how does the messaging strategy about the product, which is
that's a fair point. That's an excellent response because the nature. For those of you who don't know Teneo, Teneo really is functioning as a counselor to CEOs, and from what I know, you're brought into situations that are. It's not like brand marketing PR. It's serious existential issues for a company or a brand. So I get what you're saying, that especially in a crisis. I think this kind of research and targeting and messaging can serve as a foundation in an emotional time, or a time that could become emotional, to have an anchor, a strong foundation of who the target audiences are, who the stakeholders are, and what they know about the company, how they feel about the company, as a way to to incorporate in whatever the response would be. But I get what you're saying. In that moment, it's it's not. Sometimes the strategy goes out the window because the crisis is unexpected and may not align with the company's vision statement. So we have 4 minutes left, and if it's okay, David, I'll give you the last 4 minutes before we say goodbye. If there's anything you want to say in closing.
Well, I have been doing this for Yeah, I think I'm approaching the end of my fourth decade doing this, which is unusual considering I'm only 28 years old. But what I've seen here is there are certain principles about communication that, in spite of the changes in technology, the principles of what make great research have not changed. Those have remained a constant. The theories of how communication operates, and this is some discussions that Don Stacks and I have had, is that when we go back there and we look at the issues of theory of communication, how this works, what is the influence and how it is, we're going back to Aristotle. So what we need to understand is that the fundamentals of how people learn, how people make decisions, how issues occur, how behavior is impacted, that hasn't changed. How we have delivered the mechanism has changed. What we need to think about is that media is media. So I'll use a comment, which again will probably, if in certain places I'd probably get run out of the room, but I'll say it anyway. Social media. What's the most important operative word in the phrase in the two words? It's not social. It's media. It is another form of vision of communication. We talk about social media today the same way we talked about television broadcast television in 1948 as this unique, different thing. We adapted to it and it becomes mainstream. What we have to understand here is that the process of communication and how people learn about it, yes, the messages are sometimes delivered differently. The speed of communication has changed, but what hasn't changed is the process by which cognitive understanding and behavioral change occurs. And we have to go back to those roots and maintain those roots as we understand it in order to be great communicators and be researchers which are going to provide great advice.
Excellent closing. Thank you. Let me just remind everybody that David's book, along with his co-authors, Communication Guide for Investor Relations in an Age of Activism, was just released this week, and his book in collaboration with Don Stacks, Professional and Practitioner's Guide to Public Relations Research, Measurement, and Evaluation, now in its third edition. All of these are available on Amazon and other places. You can read David's papers, as well as many others, on the Institute for PR website. You see the URL on your screen. So let me say thanks, David, very much. Wonderful conversation. Thanks for sharing your expertise. Thanks to the audience for hanging in there. And thank you to commpro for arranging.
Thank you. This does conclude today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have a wonderful day.